As well as the door moving, I also wanted the robotic arm in the lab to move. I'm a complete novice at building mechanical things from Lego, but I knew of one basic idea to make the arm rotate back and forth. Two short lift arms attached to an axle pointing out in opposite directions would in turn knock the arms of a turn wheel, rotating it clockwise then anti-clockwise. It was a little janky, but it worked as a concept. Between these sessions I actually reworked the door mechanism, again. This time running an axle directly under it and driving the large beveled gear with a smaller one. I now needed to run axles off this as discreetly as possible to power the arm. After going through a few revisions, I managed to build something that worked reasonably well, and I felt I could hide without having to raise the floor level up several feet. But after all that work on the door mechanism, I felt I could still do better. I switched the system to be driven by worm gear and introduced a second vertical drive shaft which would drive the robotic arm. I'm not sure whether this was really any better, but the arm was now where I wanted it to be, and I was able to lower it another plate. The door and the robot arm were now working quite nicely together. Time to get those floor plates moving. Before working on getting Dr. Grant moving, I had another idea for Dr. Sattler. I scrapped the lift arm and replaced it with an elastic band, which had enough stretch to allow Ellie to move forward as the door opened and snap back as it closed. I also added a few hazard warning tiles as an idea for a display border, but we'll circle back to that later. Speaking of circles, in my quest to create the perfect windows for the control room, I came across a MOC by Jonas Kram, using arches and round canopies to create perfect circular windows. Now I'm normally a pretty honest kind of guy, but I really couldn't see any other way of effectively recreating those windows, and so I did a terrible thing, and I stole his design. Sorry, Jonas. You can find more of his amazing work on Instagram. I still had to work out just how he'd connected things together, so I turned to Studio to assist with the layout. Using Studio allows more precise measurement and alignment of parts, rather than simply eyeballing it, so I was able to test out different attachment points and spacings. In the end, I kind of just straight up copied his homework, but I hadn't managed to work out how we'd attach those canopies. Rather than frustrate myself more with the windows, I decided instead to frustrate myself with Dr. Grant. Dr. Sattler was moving nicely now, but keeping Dr. Grant upright was going to be much more of a challenge. I had considered connecting his hand to the door handle, but that would have created a sweeping arc movement pushing him into Dr. Sattler. I wanted him to be pushed away from the door as a person would be when standing behind it, so I felt a sliding plate would be best. But it needed a good, solid connection to it, otherwise Dr. Grant would be taking flying lessons. I thought something connected to the back of his leg could maybe provide some reinforcement, but nothing seemed to line up, and then I remembered that recently released posing bar. Connected to his leg and pushed into a hollow stud, this worked quite nicely, but now the lift arms behind the door had become an issue due to the longer floor plate length. I tried to solve this with a shorter L-shaped lift arm, but the result was a little wobbly. It seemed to hold up though. Having found success using a rubber band for the first floor plate, I replicated the setup for the second. Finally, everything was moving in sync. Once again, I found myself doing some work off-stream to improve the build, tweaking the framework to strengthen it and adding a new lift arm to pull the elastic band attached to Dr. Grant's sliding floor plate. In a moment of serendipity while sorting through my sister's Lego, I realised that thin Technic plates would be perfect for strengthening the floor plate itself, having a rounded end that wouldn't collide with the curved brick, and even having an axle hole to push the posing bar into. I rejigged the mechanical framework a little, and things were looking good. Having ordered some parts in, I started looking at putting the window together. Jonas appeared to have used plates with clips and bars over the tops of his windows, but I couldn't figure out just what he'd done with them, so I tried to work out my own solution. The windows were unfortunately just over 14 studs wide, which meant when attempting to attach a plate over the build, the studs wouldn't line up. Turning to Studio again, I tried a couple of unconventional methods of attaching the windows together. I felt that securing the windows from behind was the right direction to take. Clips can be attached anywhere along a bar, so I wouldn't have to worry about studs aligning, but system parts alone weren't quite stacking up right. Once again, Technic came to the rescue, but I'd still only managed to secure the window glass. I now had a way to attach the window panes to the build, but I still needed a way to attach the window frames. Eyeing up the exposed studs at the bottom of the frame, I figured I could use a thin lift arm to connect to the supports I was putting in place for the glass. It was a little awkward looking, but it did the job. Now all these supports I was putting in place weren't particularly aesthetically pleasing, but I had a plan to cover over them with a walkway. I'd originally designed this to be 5 studs wide, but as I was no longer using the full Raptor model behind the door, I thought I may as well slim it down and give myself more lab space. While reinstalling the walkway, I also added in some of the missing details from the windows, refined a few things, and generally spruced things up a little to get them looking nice. As well as the walkway behind the windows, there's also a kind of walkway in front of the windows. I didn't really want to make this too wide, as space was at a premium, so I settled on only 2 studs wide, using plates with bars to stand the handrail off the edge of it. This allowed me to stand it over the edge of the computer desk, rather than having to move the desk over a stud. At this point I carried on fleshing out the build, starting with the hazard warning border from a few episodes back, then fixing up the wall and an area in front of the door. The control room has multiple computers overseeing the operation of the park, so I wanted to add in at least the station we see Ray Arnold working at. This was largely copied from Nedry's workstation, with the addition of a second desk. Unfortunately, I didn't have the parts to correctly physically build this, so that'll have to wait for another time. With a rough design in place for the control room, I started thinking about the design of the laboratory. I needed to decide where to set the embryo storage, as that would partly dictate the space I had to work with. Now the incubator we see in the film set is really in an area that would be off the edge of the display, so I tried seating it to the right of the embryo storage, but this really didn't leave much room for a lab when I marked out the edge of my mechanical monstrosity. I threw caution to the wind and carried on regardless, as this is Lego and it can always be changed if something doesn't work. So I laid out the border design and started thinking about flooring. The lab's floor is actually 3 colours. A light grey and a sand green separated by a red stripe, and as luck would have it, Lego produces elements in all of these colours. They even produce some nice cut plates to help recreate the angle of the stripe. Setting the stripe in place wouldn't be so easy though. A technique that's good for placing plates at angles involves placing 2 1x1 plates at intervals and seating a plate over them. There are a number of angles at which you can fit plates with this system. Sadly, 45 degrees isn't one of them. I briefly entertained the idea of a turntable plate, but that angled plate was throwing the alignment of studs off all over the place. One last idea I'd had was to try floating the floor on a Technic framework. Running axles through bricks would allow precise placement along the X and Y axes, but there would still be numerous issues to contend with, having to consider placing multiple plates, the height of the floor, structural sturdiness, axle runoff, the list goes on. I decided to mull it over and look instead at getting that Raptor in place. Having filled the area behind the door with mechanical systems, I'd settled on the idea of simply having the head of the Raptor leering through the window. I still needed to use a handful of Technic elements just to set the head in the right position, but thankfully it came out okay. I did originally want the Raptor's snout to push through the crack in the door, but it's actually the claws that poke through in this scene. Was I being too ambitious with this idea though?